BrainMender podcast is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine, nursing, or other professional healthcare services, including the giving of medical advice, and no doctor-patient relationship is formed. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from this podcast is at the user's own risk. The content of this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. It is strongly recommended that all users of this podcast should not disregard or delay in obtaining professional medical consultation for any medical condition they may have. Listeners should seek the assistance of their personal healthcare professionals before making any decisions about their medical care or treatment. Thank you for listening to BrainMender.
I'm so excited to introduce our guest, Joe Dolce. Joe is a renowned writer and advocate for medical cannabis. Prior to his work in cannabis, Joe founded Joe Dolce Communications, a prominent presentation and media training company, and held editorial roles in notable publications including Vogue, Details, Gourmet, and many more. His cannabis journey began in 2016 while researching and writing Brave New Weed, a book that introduced him to the world of medical cannabis and its transformative potential. This experience led him to reevaluate his understanding of cannabis and plant medicine in general, ultimately reshaping his career path. Joe has a deep commitment to alleviating needless suffering by sharing his knowledge and experiences, advocating for responsible medical cannabis use, and broadening awareness of its therapeutic versatility and safety. This led him to found Medical Cannabis Mentor, a company that provides online education to patients and companies about cannabis and the endocannabinoid system. He's witnessed the profound impact this plant can have on individuals suffering from chronic illnesses like pain, stress, insomnia, and other conditions such as epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, and PTSD. So without further ado, please welcome Joe Dolce to BrainMender. Joe, thanks so much for being with us.
Nice to see you, Sean. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's really a pleasure to have you on and bring your expertise and your experience to our podcast. You know, so I wanted to ask you, a person's journey is long and it has so many facets to it. But give us some insight as to when you started learning about medical cannabis and how that journey kicked off.
Well, I started learning about cannabis when I was 12 years old, to be honest with you. And I didn't know much about it. I was just using it. And it was really weak back then. And I sort of miss that. I long for the day that people will start to produce low THC weed again. Actually, I'd like to start a movement called slow weed, which just, allows you to smoke a whole joint and still be able to get to the end of the movie. And I think that's maybe typical of my generation now. I'm not really sure. But I know a lot of people like that. Anyway, it started very young. And it's been with me and on and off like any relationship over the years. I would say I used it quite heavily when I was at university and still managed to graduate very well, thank you. Through adolescence, I actually started using it more through adolescence. I think when I was younger, I used it a lot for social anxiety. I don't like to diagnose everything, but I was an anxious teenager. Wasn't really happy with where I was or who I thought I was. So I think it blunted a lot of that. In college, I thought it was very sort of expanding. And I liked the way it stimulated my creative mind, which was Absolutely. That it enabled a lot of thoughts. Not all of them were very good thoughts. As a matter of fact, very few of them were good thoughts. But you could always go back the next day and edit. I used it up till I was in my 40s, and then I started tapering off. It was making me unhappy. Actually, it was making me paranoid and unhappy. It was getting stronger. I was getting older. I'm sure there's a connection, the way the body responds to cannabis as you age. No one really talks about it, but I know for myself and many other people, I've become more sensitive to it. I've not built a tolerance. It's gone the other way, an anti-tolerance. So I stopped. There's wine. There's other things to explore. Many
Absolutely.
things to explore, consciousness, meditation, many things. Anyway, around age 50 or so, I started enjoying it again. And that's what led me ultimately to write Brave New Weed, because I had this stunning revelation that I knew nothing about this plant. I mean, I grew up well before the internet, and the government was actually very efficient at blocking information. I have to say, we think they're not efficient, but they were very good and at misinformation and not telling us things. So that is why I began to research and write Brave New Week, because I really thought people who used the plant we didn't have enough support, really. There weren't enough people telling us it was an okay thing to do. It was a relatively safe thing to do. It could be used mindfully, and it could be used in different ways. How's that for a very long answer to a quick question?
I think that that's a great answer, and it really highlights a lot of the aspects that we talk about with cannabis use, such as you were talking about, hey, yeah, I thought that it helped me with my social anxiety, which, a lot of people endorse that. But again, it was self-medication, and like you said, like, well, I don't want to diagnose it. And that's just it, is a lot of people find something that they think, oh, this helps me in some way, but they're not really sure how it's helping them or what it even is helping. And then they run into problems, and not everybody has the insight like you did. Hey, this is starting to make me feel uncomfortable. Maybe I should modulate or stop using this before it becomes more of an issue for me. A lot of people go the opposite direction. They say, oh, I'm getting paranoid. Maybe I should have more. And it leads to a use disorder. So that's one of the things that we get very concerned about is, like you said, there's so little information about, well, what's the proper way to use cannabis for different disorders? And again, what disorder in this individual is even being treated? All those things are so important to have that guidance. And, in my view, to have a physician that actually, is helping manage these diagnoses, and then helping you to understand, well, here's your choices. These are the best ways to use cannabis for this disorder in terms of what the science shows us. And I think that, yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to add something to that, which I think, the war on drugs, I don't think you need a doctor to use cannabis, frankly. I think the war on drugs has been unbelievably damaging. People should be educated enough to know that, pharmakon in Greek means what? Medicine and poison. And the difference is the dose, right? And the stupid war on drugs has made us all stupid.
Yeah.
We don't, until you think about it or look at it, it doesn't occur to you that you can change the dose or change the variety or, lots of things you can change to have a different experience or stop using it. Yeah.
And like you said, the higher potencies of THC, that psychoactive component, it's just increased over time, and it's what people want, because the way it's being marketed in the recreational world is like, hey, this is an alternative to alcohol, and you can get altered instead of mindful and using the lower THC blends that would actually be much more medicinal for people. And I think what you brought up is actually really important, is that, like with anything, you can't actually rely on your doctor solely to educate you about anything anymore. There's an importance to people being advocates for themselves and learning as much. And that kind of brings me to Medical Cannabis Mentor, which, is amazing, online, accessible education, which is available. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, we started it actually for patients, and then we quickly realized that people weren't going to use it or pay for it, even though it was when we began a very minimal cost. So we moved it to a business model. So we sell to businesses, to dispensaries, in certain states to manufacturing, cultivation. There are certain states like New Jersey that actually require education of all the people that work in the industry, which I'm a fan of. I don't think it's a big burden to learn about what you're selling. And if you are a bartender at a good bar, you're constantly getting information from liquor distributors who are coming in and showing you how to make cocktails, for example. Okay, it's not the same thing, but it's an industry standard. And because of the ham-fisted way that cannabis has been rolled out, I don't even call it a system. okay, across the United States, it's very hard to apply industry standards when the government is making the industry very difficult to grow, expand, thrive. There's so many constraints from so many sides. I mean, my friends who own dispensaries, when they told me they have to pay their income tax in cash, they have to hire an armed truck to pay their government income tax.
Wow.
That something is wrong in the
Yeah.
year 2023, right? So, what was the question? I've forgotten it. But that medical cannabis mentor aims to give a broad, it's online, self-paced, interactive, hopefully engaging. We try to make it as engaging as possible. It's not like reading a textbook, looking at a picture. It's interactive. You move things around. You're asked to make choices. It's diagrammatic. There's multimedia stuff in it. Try to make the plant as alive and as vibrant as it actually is.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because that contrasts sharply with armed guards and cash transactions. And it's interesting, and just for our listeners to understand that even though many states have rolled out medical programs and recreational programs or adult use programs, it's still considered a Schedule I drug at a federal level. And you may recall from a prior episode, we talked about prohibition. And this is more or less what you're seeing in action is that these are cash transactions because they're not allowed to use the federal banking system. And there actually has been some movement at a federal level, but still, even in the medical cannabis world, you're looking at a large amount of cash being transported in literal armed, like Brinks trucks from the dispensary to wherever they're allowed to deposit that.
Sean, if you try to buy one of our courses, with a credit card, you're prohibited. You cannot. No credit card, even though we are only selling words, pictures, and videos. Wow. Okay, we do not sell plant.
But
you're zero.
But you're talking about the forbidden plant.
We're talking about
stigmatized plant.
A federal one, a Schedule I that nobody wants to go near.
Yep.
It's got the cooties. So anyway, it's completely
and that's
crazy.
The scary and that's kind of the scary part where there's so little education, and now every corner you go to in the city, people have access to cannabis and they don't know anything about it. They're just, let's pick up some.
I think they know. I think they know some things about it. Yeah. But what I think they don't have, though, is any place to consume. Like there's no such thing as a consumption lounge in New York City.
Right.
And all these dispensaries that have suddenly appear, like drop from the sky, they're all illegal and unregulated. Not all, the majority of them still, because New York State has also rolled out in the most ham-fisted way possible. You would think with 37 other states in front of them, New York State would have learned something, right?
How to roll out an adult use program. How to roll out
a program. Yeah. I mean, God. Anyway.
Yeah. I mean, from the standpoint of, like you're saying, it's decriminalized. And so a lot of these recreational dispensaries exist by virtue of the fact that they're under the limits that would be considered illegal in New York. And somehow they're not getting raided because they got bigger fish to fry in New York City right now, right?
I don't know. I'm not sure I don't really understand why it's happening, but it'll change. It'll improve.
What would be some key points you would emphasize for people who are considering medical cannabis for their conditions, and what would be some caveats for them to look out for, and things that they should look out for?
Well, if you're going to use it medically, a little bit goes a long way. So low dosing is a great place to start, and you can increase every day, and in that way also you get in touch with your body and what your body needs. Right. I think what you don't want to do, I mean, you can build certain people need to build a tolerance. For example, if you have chronic pain, you want to consume higher doses. You absolutely do, because it can work.
Right.
as effectively as anything else out there, without the addictive qualities. But if you're not using it for that, you want to sort of start slow and start low and then titrate and find out where you're happy. Also, by mixing different methods of delivery, like an edible or inhalation, you can say you have pain, for example, you can inhale and find some immediate relief. Take an edible, say you're sleeping overnight, and get extended relief. But you got to know how to do that, right? Or use a tincture to get also extended and rapid relief. So it takes a little bit of experimentation, a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of listening to your body. But it's very doable if you're willing, I should say, to take control of your condition. Lots of people I know, many of my friends, they're just going to take what the doctor gives them. They're not going to look at the label. They don't even ask about side effects. They just take it. I think because I know a lot about plant medicine and I like plant medicines, not exclusively. I actually do believe in allopathic medicines as well. But I think the two can coexist very happily. Right. But it's a different mindset. It is one where you have to say, okay, I'm in charge of my health. This is what I'm going to try. This is what I'm going to play with. This is what I'm going to experiment with.
Yeah. And a lot of what allows that is that massive safety margin, that big therapeutic window where it really takes a lot of cannabis to harm somebody, to use it improperly. But that kind of brings me to a different point, which is where are you getting this cannabis from? And do they have a certificate of analysis? And so what we were talking about earlier, where every corner has an illegal shop on it, that would not be a place where we would think people should go if they're thinking about using cannabis for medical purposes, because you don't know what's in it, right? There could be contaminants and you don't know, like you were saying, like being educated about which terpenes are good for which conditions and how much THC really is in this and how much CBD really is in this. You're only going to get that with a certificate of analysis. And, in other states, again, like you said, they've rolled out even recreational programs where the recreational product has certificate of analysis. And you actually know what you're getting versus the willy-nilly, really pop-up shops and trucks running around. I mean, these are really a cautionary tale for people who are looking for medical cannabis.
Well, it's one of the roles of people who work in dispensaries, I think, is to help people read COAs and understand what the percentages mean and how to get a sense of what effect you can predict.
Right.
Predictability is sort of nice when it comes to any drug, really.
Absolutely.
I know some people don't like to call cannabis a drug, but whatever.
Well, I mean, it's a plant that has 256 drugs in it, I guess.
At least.
And that's what almost never gets talked about. What people might not understand is what's termed the entourage effect, right? Which you and I have talked about before, and it's that each plant may have a slightly different effect on each person. If you think about each person is so unique and so individualized, well, if you look at all these different strains of cannabis out there, each one of them has a different profile, and there are literally hundreds of different chemicals that are active in our bodies. And the way that they all interact with each other in our bodies determines the ultimate effect that they're going to have. So it's almost like an orchestra playing, not just a soloist, like here's a little white pill with one little drug in it, like the pharmaceutical industry does. This is a plant that has an interaction with your body. And so the more you understand about it, the more it might be able to help you, and the more you can do what Joe's talking about, the predictability, like what is this going to do if I take this? What is it going to do to me? And then, of course, like you were saying, starting low and going slow and listening to your body and sort of speaking to listening to your body in your book, Brave New Weed, you relayed a very kind of cautionary but almost entertaining in a way, the way that it read, tale about your personal experience with cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, which I have talked about on the pod, but just to catch our listeners up, we always talk about, well, cannabis is good for nausea and vomiting and people who are having difficulty with their appetite. You think about it that way, but in fact, there's a paradoxical disorder where people might suffer from severe vomiting in a cyclical fashion, severe nausea, severe abdominal cramping, and dizziness. And anyway, I'll pose the question back to you. What was your personal experience?
Oh, it was very unpleasant, and it went on for years.
Oh man.
So it started when I had my first dab. When I was reporting the book. It's hard to talk about this without grossing people out, but it was a very dizzying experience. I was in a restaurant and suddenly the floor started spinning and I was on a boat. I felt like I was on a boat and I had to leave the restaurant and go outside and sort of purge, let's say, for a very long time. And
Wow.
I woke up in the morning and I was really confused. It was actually the point when I knew I had to write the book because there was nothing written about it. I certainly didn't know the word hyperemesis. No idea what it meant. And there was very little written about it. And it was very baffling because, having lived through the AIDS crisis, we all knew that people use weed to quell nausea, not bring it on anyway. So I that's why I started looking at what this plant is and how it works in the mind and in the body and what the endocannabinoid system is and da. And so it continued to happen to me periodically over about 7 or 8 years. And it was, no matter what anybody said, it was not related to dose. It was not related to variety. It was not related to method of use. It happened when I was smoking. It happened when I was just having a puff on a joint. It happened once with an edible that I would puke. And the last time it happened, I fainted.
Wow.
I fainted in a restaurant, a very low dose edible, which was so odd. And I ended up at a conference. I ended up in the ER at the Cleveland Clinic.
Wow.
Where they did nothing. I mean, they just said, "What's the matter?" I said, "I took an edible and I got nauseated and I fainted." And they gave me some electrolytes and I sat there for 2 hours and I went home in an Uber. I just walked out on my own. But the consequence was that I have basically stopped using weed because I don't want to faint anymore.
No.
I mean, that's insane. And I don't want to puke. That's for sure. That was very unpleasant and makes you really, not the most popular person at the party. And so
that's hard to imagine about you, but I'll take your word for it.
Yeah, you can trust that. So anyway, I, my relationship with weed changed yet again.
Right.
In that, it was basically saying to me, we need a break, baby.
Yeah.
We need a break. Let's have a little bit of a split. So I'm not sure we're divorced yet, but we're definitely in a separation.
Right. Yeah. Sadly. And unfortunately,
I find it sad. I find it sad because I like weed still. Yeah. I like, in the right circumstance, in the right dose, it's a very fun plant. It just is,
Right. I mean, but really what you happened upon, which is, you know what? I don't think I can have any amount of this. That is the recommendation is basically abstinence is the only real known treatment for cannabis hyperemesis syndrome. And there's a lot of conjecture as to what can lead to it. But it's interesting that it kicked off with dabbing. And, for the listeners who might not know what that is, that's a highly concentrated way to administer cannabis extracts. It's kind of a waxy extract of cannabis that has very high amounts of THC. And perhaps that sensitized your receptors to the point that now it was going to tip them over from the pleasant, appetite-inducing, nausea-suppressing cannabis that you'd always known to now this is a different animal. And that's part of the mystery of the endocannabinoid system. Nobody really understands how can something that's involved with suppressing nausea and vomiting and with helping you with appetite, all of a sudden turn against and do the exact opposite of that, even in small amounts. But certainly it's helped us to understand that, the endocannabinoid system doesn't necessarily do one thing. It balances things. And then if it goes out of balance, then we can have very unpredictable and unfortunate results. It sounds like you had some really bad experiences, and I'm sorry for that. I'm glad you figured out how to prevent it from happening again.
Well, listen, the good news is that cannabis is not addictive. So
Absolutely.
getting off of it, stopping it is not that hard. I mean, it's like missing your friend. You miss your friend, but eventually you learn to live without it. And that right. I think is the good. Frankly, I do think that's the good news.
Well, I think it is good news. I mean, cannabis has some very interesting physical withdrawal symptoms. And we'll come back to that in a second. But what's interesting is that for you and in your experience, you can turn it off and on with very little problem. But what we do find with a lot of our patients is that they have a psychological addiction to cannabis. And the folks that develop cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, unfortunately, will relapse because of their psychological addiction to using cannabis. And despite they know it's going to start again, the vomiting is going to start again, unfortunately, they still go back and they end up needing psychological addiction therapy counseling for the cannabis use to prevent it and prevent that dysfunction in their lives. And that's kind of
there's new evidence that psilocybin can eradicate cannabis. I don't call it addiction. I call it dependence because I don't think it's the same thing as an addiction from my experience with addicts. But that psilocybin can be used to thwart that, which is also interesting. Another plant can, pretty much one and done.
Right. And there's a lot of interesting research going on with opiate addiction as well with cannabis, but also with psilocybin. And, it's an interesting space in terms of these are Schedule I drugs. And on the other hand, opiates, which we know, okay, so heroin is a Schedule I drug, but all of the rest, the OxyContin and oxycodone and MS-Con, MS-Codone and fentanyl, and these are all Schedule II drugs. And as a result of that, they're much more accessible, and they are unfortunately resulting in the opiate crisis. So many lives have been ruined because obviously with opiates, there are severe physical and mental addictions that occur. And it's a very different landscape than what you're talking about with cannabis and psilocybin. For those who may not be familiar with it, that's, if the street vernacular would be like magic mushrooms contain psilocybin. And there's been a lot of research going on for a variety of diseases like post-traumatic stress disorder, addiction to other substances and other things. I think really the take home is that any drug, and cannabis included, can have predictable effects on people, but when you come down to an individual, you never really know, and any drug can create any side effect for anybody. And I think that's where mentoring comes in and education comes in, like your online education, where people can learn and unfortunately have to send you a money order or something to be able to purchase those.
PayPal. Actually, I don't know if I should say this out loud, but PayPal accepts it.
Well, that's good. I mean, at least there's some way, because literally we're talking about information and freedom of speech.
I think we're talking about critical information. I'm working on a new book called Psychedelic Pharmacy because a lot of people are interested in psychedelics, and there are lots of sources of information out there if you know where to look, and if you have the time to spend to look. But a lot of people don't. It's like, oh, here's the pill, take it, or And I think it could easily end up like we don't want to end up where we were in 1968 when they scheduled all these drugs and sort of clamped down on them and made for a very two stupid generations of people who know nothing about how to use these miraculous substances. I mean, and I mean, when you start reading about the miracles and I shouldn't call them miracles, but they are almost miraculous that one dose of psilocybin can end treatment-resistant depression in 70% of the people studied. 70%! I mean, no studies get those numbers. And these are Johns Hopkins, NYU, these are big, impressive organizations, academic institutions that have run these studies. These are not slipshod studies.
Yeah.
It is just extraordinary. And end-of-life anxiety, addiction, smoking addiction, cluster headaches, anorexia. It's just an astounding array of illnesses that these things treat or appear to treat. We don't have the evidence hard right now, but it's coming. It is stunning, and I think most of these things are plant based. Not all, but many. MDMA not really, although it's quite based. It's quite close to sassafras. MDMA.
Interesting.
Ketamine, no. Ketamine has no natural, what do you call it? Affiliation, I guess you would say. But and it's not exactly a real psychedelic. It's not strictly categorized as psychedelic, but it also has extraordinary effects with some people in depression and all those things. So
there is a nasal preparation of ketamine now that's approved for refractory, severe depression, and it's highly effective, and it is amazing. Ketamine was used as a veterinary sedative, basically. Then it was used for human anesthesia purposes, and then a lot of people with severe depression were waking up from a surgical procedure that they had received ketamine in, and saying, I feel better. I don't feel depressed at all anymore. And so they started studying this effect. What it kind of brings to mind, though, is this is a pharmaceutical that has, at that time was given intravenously, and, it's okay to study that, but it's not okay to study plants because those are, stigmatized and prohibited by the government. So I guess that's
listen, it's also hard to study plants because they're not single molecules. Sure. They're not single action. They're multi-action. And
like we were talking.
Clinical trials, can be designed, but there's a big gap. And a lot of people are talking about redesigning the model of study because it's not sufficient for these acting substances that act in the brain, and so many, we think the brain, by the way, we're not even sure. The brain, the mind, the body.
There's good evidence that a lot of what goes on with long COVID just came out. A lot of the effects have to do with serotonin depletion.
Isn't that interesting?
Guts. Yeah. And if you think about, a lot of people would think of, serotonin's involved in depression somehow, because we know that there's a lot of drugs that work on the serotonin system to treat that. You wonder, where are those acting? And really, there's no way to separate any part of your body from any other part. When we start talking about the mind, we have to accept it's not just your brain that's creating our mind.
It seems to be everywhere.
That's my concept. But I guess that's a good segue to where is this space heading? We have this medicinal plant, which has really incredible broad range of application, but we also have this capitalist drive to recreational use. And where's it all heading? Are we going to lose it as a medicinal? Is society just going to move on and start thinking of it the way you think of alcohol? And where are we heading with this?
Well, I think you should ask your colleagues that question because, frankly, doctors are the most resistant to using plant medicines of any people that I've ever met.
That's a good point.
As many of them that I love and know, they're incredibly resistant. And, in a way, they're the the first targets of the drug wars.
Right.
And also they stand to lose their licenses in many instances.
Absolutely.
Because, breaking Schedule 1 is not exactly a cool thing.
Very
but
true.
There's not a lot of openness to it unless you're an integrative or a functional medicine doctor, from what I've seen anyway. So that's one thing. I have no way of predicting where the politics will lead on this. How can I possibly predict the state of politics in the United States at the current moment?
Yeah.
Why Joe Biden has not moved, well, I guess he's had a few other things on his mind, but why he has not moved to legalize or at least change the scheduling is confusing to me, because the studies show 68% of Americans are in favor of legalization, and that number is on par with blue and red. I mean, it's the one thing in America that pretty much everybody can agree on, is that cannabis should be legalized. And
absolutely.
and yet,
that's a popular perception, or at least that it shouldn't be Schedule 1 because there's so much medical data that supports that. Well, at least, even if we accept that there could be risks, which seem minimal compared to other drugs that are Schedule 1, like heroin, and, cocaine is a Schedule 2 drug because it can numb your eye for ophthalmologic procedures. So, right there means that it's, less harmful than cannabis. But if you think of it from a layperson standpoint, that that's not true. So it is very interesting that we're still in this political landscape where, like you're saying, most physicians don't have any education on cannabis or the endocannabinoid system itself. Just because it's associated with cannabis, there's no medical education surrounding the endocannabinoid system.
None.
And so the very understanding of how even brain cells communicate with each other, you're missing a layer of intricacy there, because they're not being taught about this feedback system, the endocannabinoid system. Yeah. So
sorry to not have my Svengali ball out on you, but I've stopped looking ahead, because honestly, I really thought the whole thing would be legalized 4 or 5 years ago. I really thought we'd be in a very different place today, especially from when I wrote Brave New We, when it was published in 2016-17. I really thought by now we'd be on the other side of this, looking back, giggling.
Right.
And yet it still lumbers forward in the most incomprehensible way.
Absolutely. Well, listen, Joe, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast, and I greatly appreciate your time and your expertise and sharing it with us. And I hope to have you back and talk more about these interesting topics that we get into here.
Thanks for having me, Sean. Keep going.
We will endeavor. And thanks all to our listeners for tuning in again to the BrainMender podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, subscribe, and share with all your friends and family. And thanks again for joining us on BrainMender.